The summer of 1886 blazed mercilessly across Dodge City, Kansas, where the railroad tracks divided civilization from wilderness, and where men's souls were measured not by their past, but by their courage when it mattered most. The sun hung low like a copper coin against the endless prairie sky when a lone figure rode into town, a man whose weathered face told stories of loss, whose steady hands had known both violence and tenderness. They called him the Lonely Rancher, though none knew his real name. His horse, a magnificent black stallion named Thunder, carried him with the dignity of a fallen king returning to reclaim his throne. But this was no triumphant return. This was the arrival of a man running from ghosts that refused to stay buried. "Hi, how are you? I'm interrupting quickly just to ask you to click on the like button and subscribe to the channel. This will help a lot. Thank you, and I hope you like the story." The townspeople watched from behind curtained windows as he dismounted outside Murphy's saloon. His clothes were travel-worn but well-made, his boots expensive leather cracked by countless miles. Most telling were his eyes, steel gray and haunted, the eyes of a man who had seen too much and lost everything that mattered. "Another drifter," muttered Sheriff Briggs from his porch, spitting tobacco juice into the dust. "Hope he don't cause trouble." But trouble was already brewing 3 blocks away, where a gang of 5 outlaws had cornered a young girl behind Henderson's general store. The child, no more than 12, pressed herself against the wooden wall as the men closed in like wolves circling wounded prey. "Please," she whispered, her voice barely audible above the sound of their cruel laughter. "I haven't done anything wrong." The gang's leader, a scarred brute named Jake Morrison, reached for her with grimy hands. "Wrong place, wrong time, little girl. Your daddy owes us money, and you're gonna help us collect." That's when the voice cut through the evening air like a blade through silk, deep, commanding, and absolutely fearless. "Don't touch her." The Lonely Rancher stood at the mouth of the alley, his hand resting casually on his gun belt. But there was nothing casual about the fire in his eyes or the way he positioned himself between the child and her tormentors. Morrison sneered, revealing broken teeth. "This ain't your business, stranger. Walk away while you still can. I'm making it my business." The rancher's voice never wavered. "The girl leaves with me. Now." The tension stretched like a bowstring as the 5 outlaws spread out, hands hovering over their weapons. The girl watched in terrified fascination as this stranger, this man who owed her nothing, prepared to risk everything for her safety. "You picked the wrong fight, old man," Morrison growled, his hand inching toward his gun. What happened next would be talked about in Dodge City for generations. The Lonely Rancher moved with the fluid grace of a man who had danced with death countless times and always led. His Colt .45 appeared in his hand, as if by magic, the barrel steady as a mountain peak. "I've been picking fights longer than you've been breathing, son," he said quietly, "and I'm still here." The standoff lasted an eternity that was really only seconds. Then Morrison made his move and learned why some men become legends while others become cautionary tales. The rancher's shot echoed through the alley, and Morrison's gun flew from his hand, his wrist shattered but his life spared. "Next man who moves gets more than a broken bone," the rancher announced calmly, his weapon now trained on the remaining 4 outlaws. "Take your friend and ride out. If I see any of you in this town again, we'll finish this conversation permanently." The gang retreated, carrying their wounded leader and muttering threats that everyone knew were empty. As the dust settled, the Lonely Rancher holstered his gun and turned to the girl, his fierce expression melting into something surprisingly gentle. "You hurt, child?" She shook her head. tears streaming down her dirt-stained cheeks. "Why did you help me? You don't even know me." The rancher knelt to her level, his voice soft as morning rain. "Sometimes that's exactly when help matters most. What's your name?" "Sarah," she whispered. "Sarah Mitchell. Well, Sarah Mitchell, He paused, as if the name he was about to give wasn't quite his own. "I'm the lonely rancher, and you're safe now." But safety was a luxury neither of them could afford for long. As word of the confrontation spread through Dodge City like wildfire, curious eyes watched from every doorway and window. The girl had no family anyone knew of, and the stranger had just made enemies of the most dangerous gang in 3 counties. Dr. Emma Watson, the town's only physician and one of its few voices of reason, approached them cautiously. "The child needs food and shelter," she said, studying the unlikely pair. "And you, sir, need to understand what you've gotten yourself into." The lonely rancher stood, his hand protectively on Sarah's shoulder. "I understand perfectly, ma'am. I've got a room at the boarding house. The girl stays with me." Gasps rippled through the gathering crowd. A unmarried man taking in a strange child? In 1886 Dodge City, such arrangements raised eyebrows and tongues in equal measure. "That ain't proper," called out Mrs. Henderson, the storekeeper's wife. "What do we know about either of them?" The rancher's jaw tightened, but his voice remained steady. "You know I just risked my life for a child I'd never met. Sometimes that tells you everything you need to know about a person." As night fell over Dodge City, the lonely rancher and Sarah sat in his modest room above the boarding house, sharing a simple meal of bread and stew. The girl ate hungrily, as if she hadn't seen food in days, while her protector watched the street below through thin curtains. "Are you really going to take care of me?" Sarah asked suddenly, her voice small but hopeful. The rancher turned from the window, and for a moment his carefully guarded expression cracked, revealing a pain so deep it seemed to echo from his very soul. "I'm going to try, child. God help me. I'm going to try." Neither of them spoke of the secrets they carried, the girl's mysterious past that had made her a target, or the tragedy that had driven a once prominent man to wander the frontier alone. But in that quiet room, as the sounds of Dodge City settled into evening rhythms, an unlikely family began to form. Outside, Sheriff Briggs met with a well-dressed man in the shadows behind the jail. "The stranger's got the girl," Briggs reported. "Morrison's gang is licking their wounds, but they'll be back." The well-dressed man smiled coldly. "Good. Let them soften him up first. Then we'll take care of both problems permanently." As the first chapter of their story closed, neither the lonely rancher nor Sarah knew that their greatest challenges lay ahead, or that the truth about their connected pasts would shake Dodge City to its very foundations. 3 weeks had passed since the alley confrontation, and Dodge City buzzed with speculation about the unlikely pair who had disrupted its careful balance of corruption and complacency. The lonely rancher and Sarah had settled into a routine that scandalized some and inspired others. Morning walks to the general store, afternoons spent reading in the boarding house parlor, and evenings when the man who claimed no past taught the girl who seemed to have none how to read the stars. But peace was a fragile thing in a town where secrets festered like infected wounds. "It ain't natural, Mrs. No." Henderson declared loudly enough for half the street to hear as the rancher and Sarah passed her store. "A man like that, taking in a strange girl, mark my words, no good will come of it." The rancher's jaw tightened, but he kept walking, his hand steady on Sarah's shoulder. The girl had grown quieter in recent days, the weight of the town's judgment pressing down on her young shoulders like a physical burden. Dr. Emma Watson watched the exchange from her clinic window, her heart aching for both the man and child who had become outcasts for the simple crime of finding each other. She had seen the rancher's gentle care of Sarah, witnessed the way the girl's nightmares had slowly faded under his patient protection. Whatever secrets they carried, their bond was real and healing. That afternoon, as storm clouds gathered over the prairie, Sarah sat in the boarding house parlor while the rancher conducted business at the bank. She was attempting to read when a shadow fell across her book. Well, well, if it ain't the little princess. Sarah looked up to find Jake Morrison standing in the doorway, his right arm in a sling but his eyes burning with malice. Behind him lurked two of his gang members, their hands resting on their gun belts. "Your protector ain't here to save you now," Morrison sneered, stepping closer. "Time to finish what we started." But Sarah Mitchell was not the same terrified child who had cowered in the alley 3 weeks ago. Living with the lonely rancher had taught her that courage wasn't the absence of fear. It was action in spite of it. "He'll be back soon," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. "And when he finds you here?" Morrison laughed harshly. "He won't find anything but an empty room and a note saying you ran off. Happens all the time with ungrateful orphans." What Morrison didn't know was that Mrs. Abernathy, the boarding house owner, was listening from the kitchen. The elderly woman had initially disapproved of the rancher's arrangement, but weeks of watching his devoted care of Sarah had changed her mind. Now, seeing the child threatened in her own establishment, something fierce awakened in the old woman's heart. She slipped out the back door and ran toward the bank, her skirts flying, and her voice raised in alarm. "Help! Someone help! They're after the girl!" The lonely rancher was just emerging from his meeting with the bank president when Mrs. Abernathy's cries reached him. One look at her terrified face told him everything he needed to know. He was running before she finished speaking, his boots pounding against the wooden sidewalk as townspeople scattered from his path. Back at the boarding house, Morrison had grabbed Sarah's arm, his grip tight enough to leave bruises. "Come on, little girl, time for a ride." "Let go of me." Sarah struggled against his hold, her book falling to the floor with a sharp crack. "Shut up and move, or this gets worse for both of us." That's when the front door exploded inward, torn from its hinges by the force of the lonely rancher's shoulder. He stood in the doorway like an avenging angel, his eyes blazing with a fury that made Morrison's blood run cold. "I believe the lady asked you to let her go." Morrison's hand moved toward his gun, but the rancher was already in motion. What followed was not a gunfight but a reckoning, swift, brutal, and decisive. Within seconds, Morrison lay unconscious on the parlor floor, while his two companions found themselves staring down the barrel of the rancher's Colt. "Same offer as before," the rancher said quietly. "Take your friend and ride out. But this time, if I see any of you within 50 miles of this town, I won't be so merciful." As the outlaws dragged Morrison away, Sheriff Briggs finally arrived, his face flushed, and his badge gleaming with suspicious newness. "What's all this commotion about?" "Self-defense," Dr. Watson said firmly, having arrived just in time to witness the confrontation's end. "These men broke into Mrs. Abernathy's establishment and threatened a child." Briggs looked disappointed, as if he'd hoped for a different outcome. "Well, I suppose no real harm was done. But rancher, you're walking a thin line. This town values peace and order." The lonely rancher studied the sheriff with those penetrating gray eyes. "Funny thing about peace, Sheriff. Sometimes you have to fight for it." That evening, as Sarah helped Mrs. Abernathy clean up the damaged parlor, the old woman made an unexpected confession. "I owe you both an apology," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I let gossip and prejudice cloud my judgment. But watching that man risk everything for you today, well, It reminded me what real family looks like. Sarah smiled, the first genuine smile anyone had seen from her in weeks. He's not my real father, you know, but he's the best one I could have asked for. Mrs. Abernathy paused in her sweeping. Child, sometimes the family we choose is stronger than the one we're born into. Later that night, as the rancher tucked Sarah into her bed, she asked the question that had been haunting her for days. Why do they hate us so much? We haven't hurt anyone. The rancher sat on the edge of her bed, his weathered face soft in the lamplight. Fear, mostly. People are afraid of what they don't understand, and they don't understand how a man and a girl with no blood between them can become family. But we are family, aren't we? Yes, child, we are. Sarah was quiet for a moment, then spoke again, her voice barely above a whisper. I remember things sometimes. About before. About why those men were after me. The rancher's body went very still. What kind of things? My father. My real father. He wasn't a poor man like everyone thinks. He had money, lots of it, and he hid something before he died. Something important. The rancher's hands clenched into fists. Sarah, listen to me very carefully. You must never speak of this to anyone else. Do you understand? She nodded, frightened by the intensity in his voice. But why? Because, child, if what you're remembering is true, then those men weren't just random outlaws. They were hired to find you, and whoever hired them won't stop until they get what they're looking for. As thunder rolled across the prairie and rain began to patter against the windows, the lonely rancher made a decision that would change everything. It was time to stop running from his past and start preparing for a fight that had been years in the making. In his coat pocket, hidden beneath layers of worn leather, lay a letter he had carried for 3 years, a letter that would explain everything if Sarah was ready to hear the truth. But first, he had to make sure they both lived long enough for the telling. Outside, in the shadows beyond the streetlights, eyes watched and waited. The game was far from over, and the stakes were higher than anyone in Dodge City could imagine. The morning after the second confrontation dawned gray and ominous, with storm clouds gathering like an army on the horizon. The lonely rancher stood at his window, watching the street below with the careful attention of a man who knew danger could arrive from any direction. 3 weeks of relative peace had ended, and now the real battle was about to begin. Sarah sat at the small table, picking at her breakfast while stealing glances at her protector. The events of the previous day had shaken her more than she wanted to admit, not just because of the physical danger, but because of the memories that were beginning to surface like bubbles rising from the depths of a dark pond. You're troubled, child, the rancher observed, turning from the window. Want to talk about it? Sarah set down her fork and looked directly at him, her young face serious beyond her years. I've been having dreams about my father, about the day he died. The rancher's expression grew carefully neutral, but Sarah caught the slight tightening around his eyes. What kind of dreams? He was scared, really scared. He kept saying someone was coming, someone who wanted to hurt us. And he gave me something. She pressed her hand to her chest, just above her heart. Something important. The rancher moved to the table and sat across from her, his voice gentle but urgent. Sarah, I need you to think very carefully. Do you remember what he gave you? Before she could answer, a sharp knock echoed through the room. Both of them froze, the rancher's hand instinctively moving toward his gun. But the voice that called through the door was familiar and welcome. It's Emma Watson. I need to speak with you both. It's important. The rancher opened the door to find Dr. Watson standing in the hallway, her usually composed face tight with worry. Behind her stood an unexpected figure, a tall, distinguished man in an expensive suit, his silver hair perfectly groomed despite the early hour. "This is Judge Harrison from Kansas City," Dr. Watson explained quickly. "He's been looking for Sarah for months." The rancher's body tensed, his hand moving closer to his weapon. "Looking for her, why?" Judge Harrison stepped forward, his eyes kind but serious. "Because, Mr. Rancher, Sarah Mitchell is my granddaughter, and her father was my son." The words hit the room like a thunderbolt. Sarah gasped, her hand flying to her mouth, while the rancher studied the judge with those penetrating gray eyes. "Prove it," the rancher said quietly. Judge Harrison reached into his coat and withdrew a small daguerreotype. The image showed a younger version of himself standing beside a beautiful woman and a man who bore a striking resemblance to Sarah. "This is my son, Thomas Mitchell, and his wife Mary, Sarah's parents." Sarah stared at the photograph, tears streaming down her cheeks. "That's him. That's my father." "Thomas was a federal investigator," Judge Harrison continued, his voice heavy with grief. "He was investigating a land fraud scheme that reached all the way to Washington. He discovered that someone was using forged documents to steal homestead claims from settlers, then selling the land to railroad companies for enormous profits." The rancher leaned back in his chair, pieces of a puzzle finally clicking into place. "And he was killed for it." "Murdered," the judge confirmed, "along with his wife. They made it look like an accident, but Thomas had sent me a letter before he died. He said he had evidence that would bring down the entire operation and that he was hiding it somewhere safe." Sarah's hand went to her chest again, and this time she pulled out a small locket that had been hidden beneath her dress. "He gave me this the night before he died. He said to keep it safe and never let anyone see it." Judge Harrison's eyes widened. "May I?" With trembling fingers, Sarah opened the locket. Inside, instead of a photograph, was a tiny rolled piece of paper. The judge carefully extracted it and unrolled it, revealing a series of numbers and letters. "It's a code," he breathed. "The location of his evidence." Dr. Watson, who had been listening in stunned silence, suddenly spoke up. "That's why Morrison's gang was after her. Someone hired them to find that locket." The rancher stood abruptly, his face grim. "And whoever hired them knows we have it now. We need to move, and we need to move fast." But even as he spoke, the sound of approaching horses echoed through the street below. The rancher moved to the window and cursed under his breath. At least 20 armed men were surrounding the boarding house, led by a figure that made his blood run cold. "Well, well," he murmured, "if it isn't my old friend." Sarah joined him at the window and gasped. The man leading the group was impeccably dressed, with cold blue eyes and a smile that never reached them. Even from a distance, his presence radiated danger and authority. "Who is that?" she whispered. The rancher's voice was barely audible. "That, child, is Marcus Blackwood, the man who destroyed my life 3 years ago." Judge Harrison moved to the window and paled. "Blackwood? He's one of the most powerful land speculators in the territory. If he's involved in this, then we're dealing with more than just a fraud scheme," the rancher finished. "We're dealing with a conspiracy that reaches to the highest levels of government." Downstairs, Mrs. Abernathy's voice could be heard arguing with the men, but her protests were quickly silenced. Heavy footsteps began climbing the stairs, and the rancher knew their time was up. "There's a back staircase," Dr. Watson said urgently. "It leads to the alley behind the building." The rancher shook his head. "They'll have it covered. Blackwood doesn't leave anything to chance." Sarah looked between the adults, her young mind working quickly. "What if we don't run? What if we face them? Child, there are 20 of them, and one of me. But you're not alone," Judge Harrison said firmly. "I didn't come to Dodge City by myself. I brought federal marshals with me. They're positioned around the town waiting for my signal." The rancher stared at him in amazement. "You knew this would happen." "I suspected. Thomas's investigation was getting close to something big when he was killed. I've been tracking the conspiracy ever since, waiting for the right moment to strike." A voice boomed from the street below. Blackwood's voice, cultured and commanding. "Rancher, I know you're up there. Send down the girl and the locket, and I might let you live." The rancher moved to the window and called back, his voice carrying clearly in the morning air. "I've got a better idea, Marcus. Why don't you come up here and take them?" Blackwood's laughter was cold as winter wind. "Still the same stubborn fool? Very well, we'll do this the hard way." As the sound of splintering wood echoed from downstairs, Judge Harrison pulled out a small mirror and began flashing signals toward the courthouse. Within seconds, answering flashes came from buildings all around the town square. The rancher checked his weapons and looked at Sarah, his expression fierce but loving. "Stay close to me, child. Whatever happens, we face it together." Sarah nodded, her fear transformed into determination. Together. The final confrontation was about to begin, and with it, the truth that would either save Dodge City or destroy it forever. The boarding house erupted in chaos as Blackwood's men stormed the building. The lonely rancher positioned himself at the top of the stairs, his Colt drawn and ready, while Judge Harrison shielded Sarah behind an overturned table. Dr. Watson crouched beside them, her medical bag clutched tightly in her hands. "Last chance, rancher." Blackwood's voice echoed up the stairwell. "Send down the girl and save yourself a lot of pain." The rancher's response was a bullet that splintered the banister inches from the first man's head. "Come and take her, Marcus." What followed was a fierce gunfight that would be remembered in Dodge City for generations. The rancher, fighting with the skill of a man who had nothing left to lose, held the staircase against overwhelming odds. His shots were precise and deadly, each bullet finding its mark with the accuracy born of desperation and righteous fury. But even his legendary skill couldn't hold back 20 men forever. As his ammunition ran low and Blackwood's forces pressed closer, it seemed that their story would end in tragedy. That's when the windows of the boarding house exploded inward as federal marshals rappelled through them like avenging angels. Judge Harrison's signal had worked perfectly, and now the hunters had become the hunted. "Federal marshals!" shouted the lead agent. "Drop your weapons!" The tide of battle turned in an instant. Blackwood's hired guns, faced with federal authority and superior firepower, began surrendering one by one. But Blackwood himself was nowhere to be seen, until Sarah spotted him climbing through a rear window, making his escape. "He's getting away!" she cried, pointing toward the back of the building. The rancher didn't hesitate. He vaulted over the banister and raced through the boarding house, bursting out the back door just as Blackwood reached his horse. The two men faced each other in the narrow alley, the morning sun casting long shadows between them. "It's over, Marcus," the rancher said, his gun trained on his enemy. "The evidence is in federal hands. Your conspiracy is finished." Blackwood smiled, that cold, calculating smile. "Is it? Do you really think this ends with me? The network I built reaches into every level of government. Even if I fall, others will take my place. Maybe, but they'll do it without you." Blackwood's hand moved toward his weapon, but he paused as footsteps echoed behind the rancher. Sarah appeared in the doorway, the locket clutched in her small hands. "You killed my parents," she said, her young voice steady despite the tears streaming down her cheeks. "You destroyed their lives for money." Blackwood's expression softened slightly, and for a moment, he looked almost human. "Child, you don't understand the forces at work here. Your father was going to destroy something bigger than himself, bigger than all of us. He was going to stop you from stealing from innocent people, Sarah replied firmly. That's what good people do. The rancher felt a surge of pride at her courage, but he never took his eyes off Blackwood. It's over, Marcus. Surrender now, and maybe you'll live to see trial. Blackwood's laugh was bitter. You still don't understand, do you? This was never about the money. This was about power, about building something that would last. And you, his eyes fixed on the rancher with sudden recognition. You're not just some drifter who happened to save a girl. You're Thomas Mitchell's partner. You're the federal agent who disappeared 3 years ago. Sarah gasped, turning to stare at the rancher. Is that true? The rancher's jaw tightened, but he nodded slowly. My name is James Harrison. I was Thomas's partner in the investigation. When they killed him and Mary, I thought they'd killed you too. I've been hunting Blackwood ever since. Harrison? Sarah's eyes widened. But Judge Harrison said, he's my father, James confirmed, never taking his gun off Blackwood. When I disappeared, he never stopped looking for me, or for you. Blackwood seized the moment of distraction to draw his weapon, but James was ready. The 2 shots rang out simultaneously, echoing through the alley like thunder. When the gun smoke cleared, Blackwood lay in the dust, his conspiracy dying with him. James holstered his weapon and turned to Sarah, his expression gentle despite the violence that had just occurred. I'm sorry I lied to you, child. I wanted to tell you the truth, but I had to be sure you were safe first. Sarah ran to him, throwing her arms around his waist. I don't care what your name is. You saved me. You became my family when I had no one. Judge Harrison appeared in the alley, followed by Dr. Watson and several federal marshals. The older man's eyes were bright with tears as he looked at his son and granddaughter. James, he said simply, welcome home. The reunion was interrupted by Sheriff Briggs, who arrived with several of his deputies. But instead of offering assistance, he was pointing a gun at the federal agents. I'm afraid I can't let you take those documents, he said, his voice shaking slightly. Mr. Blackwood was a valued member of this community. Dr. Watson stepped forward, her face flushed with anger. Sheriff, you're making a terrible mistake. No, ma'am. The mistake was letting federal agents operate in my town without permission. That's when Mrs. Abernathy appeared, flanked by a dozen townspeople, including the bank president, the mayor, and even Mrs. Henderson. They had all witnessed the morning's events, and their faces showed a mixture of shame and determination. Sheriff Briggs, the mayor said formally, you're relieved of duty. We've voted to request federal oversight of this town until proper elections can be held. Briggs looked around at the faces surrounding him and slowly lowered his weapon. The corruption that had infected Dodge City was finally being exposed to the light. 3 months later, Dodge City had transformed into a thriving, honest community. The evidence from Thomas Mitchell's investigation had led to dozens of arrests and the recovery of thousands of acres of stolen land. The railroad companies involved had been forced to pay massive restitution to the affected families. James Harrison had officially adopted Sarah and accepted a position as the town's new sheriff. Judge Harrison had decided to retire to Dodge City to be near his family, while Dr. Watson had been elected mayor in a landslide victory. On a warm autumn evening, James and Sarah sat on the porch of their new home, watching the sunset paint the prairie in shades of gold and crimson. Sarah was reading aloud from a book of poetry while James whittled a small wooden horse. Do you think they're proud of us? Sarah asked suddenly, looking up at the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. James followed her gaze upward. Your parents? I know they are, child. They're watching over us both. Sarah smiled and returned to her reading, but James continued to stare at the stars, thinking about the long journey that had brought them to this moment. He had come to Dodge City as a broken man, haunted by failure and loss. But in saving Sarah, he had found something he thought was lost forever, the chance to be part of a real family. Mrs. Abernathy appeared in the doorway, carrying a tray of fresh cookies and milk. "Time for dessert," she announced cheerfully. The elderly woman had become like a grandmother to Sarah, and her boarding house had become the unofficial community center of the new Dodge City. As they sat together sharing cookies and stories, James reflected on the words that had started it all. "Don't touch her." A simple declaration that had changed everything, proving that sometimes the most important battles are fought not for glory or gold, but for the simple right of the innocent to live without fear. The lonely rancher was lonely no more. He had found his family, his purpose, and his home. And in the growing darkness of the Kansas night, 3 generations of Harrisons looked toward a future bright with promise and hope. In the distance, a train whistle echoed across the prairie, carrying new settlers toward new dreams. Dodge City was ready to welcome them all. Hello, how are you? Did you enjoy the story? Like, share, comment on which city you're watching from, and subscribe to the channel The Best Wild West to help us continue adding new amazing videos. Thank you very much and come back often.